This is a friend of mine. A few years ago, her nose started bleeding, and she had to go to the hospital to get the vein cauterized because it just wouldn't stop. But during that very simple, very routine procedure, she became infected with a bacterium called Streptococcus in her sinuses. Streptococcus is a very common bacterium, and I'm pretty sure that most of you have been infected with it at one point or another in your life. Generally, though, it's very easily treated using antibiotics, but not in my friend's case, because this Streptococcus bacterium was resistant to antibiotics. So she had to visit the hospital several times to try and get rid of this infection, and during one of those subsequent visits, she became infected with another bacterium called Pseudomonas aeruginosa. This is a much more serious infection, though. And like the Streptococcus bacterium, this one too was resistant to antibiotics, not just to one, but to every single one that the doctors had at their disposal, including an antibiotic called colistin. Colistin is what we call a last resort antibiotic. It's used when all others have failed because it has severe toxic side effects. Now, several years later, my friend is still infected with this bacterium. But apart from that, she's otherwise doing fine. For many other people, though, for 700,000 people to be precise, this is not the case. Due to the evolution of antibiotic resistance, people are once again dying from simple cuts and burns like they did in the early 1900s and before. Doesn't have to be that way, though. Antibiotics are compounds used to kill or inhibit the growth of bacteria. They were discovered by Sir Alexander Fleming in 1923, and since we first learned in 1942 that we can use them to cure patients of horrible infections, we started using antibiotics in a global and non-discriminate way. But antibiotics doesn't necessarily kill all the bacteria, though. Sometimes a small percentage of the population continues to live, and their offspring continue to evolve and become more and more defended against the antibiotics. Their resistance becomes stronger. There are several ways by which bacteria can achieve resistance to antibiotics. They can evolve ways to break down the antibiotic compounds so that they're no longer harmful. Or they can evolve ways to prevent the antibiotics from entering the bacterial cell. And when this happens, we become defenseless against those infections. Sometimes the genetic information that encodes the antibiotic resistance is located on plasmids. I've been studying plasmids for more than a decade, since the beginning of my PhD. These are small little circular DNA molecules that occur in or replicate in bacterial cells. They hijack the bacterial cell's machinery much in the same way a virus hijacks your cellular machinery. But unlike a virus, plasmids can sometimes be good to their bacterial hosts. There are many different kinds of plasmids, and some of them have the ability to transfer themselves from one bacterium to another bacterium. So because these plasmids carry these antibiotic resistance genes, and because they can transfer themselves from one organism to another organism that is completely unrelated, they can be as different as a mouse to an elephant. So because of those reasons, these plasmids are central in spreading around antibiotic resistance genes very quickly, very rapidly across the world. When I do this in the lab, it just takes a few seconds for the plasmid to transfer from one bacterium to another bacterium. And that's just a few seconds for a bacterium that was sensitive to antibiotic treatment to become resistant to antibiotic treatment. Let me put this in a real-world example for you. Remember colistin, the antibiotic that failed to treat my friend? Just a few months ago, in November of last year, researchers published this manuscript detailing the discovery of an antibiotic resistance plasmid that carried resistance genes to colistin on farms in China. This plasmid had the ability to spread itself between different kinds of bacteria as well. And so, because of those abilities, not only did they find that plasmid in bacteria occurring on farms, but also on the meat products derived from those animals, and in a small number of patients in a hospital. And because of that ability to spread and replicate in different kinds of bacteria, This plasmid-mediated colicin resistance is now found all over the world in just a few short months. The evolution and spread of antibiotic resistance is completely our own fault. Like I said before, once we learned that we could use antibiotics to treat infections very easily, we started using antibiotics in a non-discriminate way globally. We use antibiotics in agriculture to fatten up animals or to prevent disease because of the high density and the confined environments that we rear those animals in. We use antibiotics very often also when it is not needed. I mentioned China earlier using the antibiotics in agriculture. But China is not the only country that does that. Globally, 70% of the antibiotics that we use are used in agriculture. The US uses almost 30 million pounds of antibiotics in agriculture each year. We need to change our ways. Research that we're doing here at the University of Idaho has shown that when a plasmid adapts to a new bacterium under antibiotic selective conditions, those evolutionary changes can actually facilitate that plasmid spreading and replicating in other diverse types of environments as well. And this can facilitate the spread of antibiotic resistance from one environment, such as the farm, to other bacteria which occur in environments such as our hospitals. We've also shown that when a bacterium has adapted to one particular plasmid, it actually becomes more permissive towards plasmids, antibiotic resistance plasmids, from other bacteria as well. And in this way, antibiotic resistance can accumulate in environments such as our hospitals. Right now, about 8 million people per year die because of cancer. Currently it's the biggest killer out there. And according to the review on antimicrobial resistance, about 700,000 people die annually because of antibiotic resistance-related infections, like I mentioned earlier. If we don't come up with a solution, or if we don't change our ways, by 2050, more than 10 million people will die due to antibiotic-related infections. This is something that we can prevent from happening. Researchers such as myself and many others out there are studying the evolution and spread of antibiotic resistance. In our lab particularly, we're trying to find ways in order to purge plasmids from bacterial communities that are resistant to the antibiotics so that they can once again become sensitive to antibiotic treatment and we can treat patients with persistent infections. But research is not enough though. We have to start with education. According to the World Health Organization, 2 out of 3 people do not understand antibiotic resistance. And as a consequence, we use antibiotics inappropriately. For example, people like to use antibiotics when they have a cold. Colds are caused by viruses, not bacteria. Antibiotics kill bacteria, not viruses. People think it's okay to use any antibiotic for any infection, or to use antibiotics without consulting their health practitioner first. This has to change. So let's educate our teachers and our kids in schools. Let's educate students and doctors in the making at universities. Let's educate our friends and our family at home about the evolution and spread of antibiotic resistance and why proper antimicrobial stewardship is so vitally important. In just more than a month from now, I'll be getting onto my bicycle and I'll be cycling from Nairobi in Kenya, 4,800 miles down south to Cape Town in 6 months through 6 African countries. Along the way, I'll be stopping at different universities and schools to educate people, not just there, but hopefully globally, on antimicrobial resistance and good antimicrobial stewardship. Now, I'm not asking any of you to go quite that far, but I'm asking each and every one of you to be an antibiotic guardian. Thank you.